Well, hey there, and welcome to Understanding Revelation. This week we are looking at chapters 11 through 13. And this week, as a whole, we're looking at the 1,260 days and seeing what that is all about. But for this study with me, I wanted to kind of zone in on just the middle passage because I'm going to be tackling this less in the four views. And I thought it was really interesting, and the process of reading through this would be helpful. So let's skim through chapter 11 just to kind of get our bearings and then read through chapter 12 together. So this starts with these two witnesses, these prophets, and with measuring the temple, with these 1,260 days, and then a beast coming out of the abyss. So we have kind of all of these ideas here. And in the end of this chapter, we have the seventh trumpet. So you remember that we had been reading all of these trumpets, but the seventh didn't happen yet. So here it is, and it's all about Christ's reign. The kingdom of the world has become the kingdom of our Lord and his Christ, and he will reign forever, right? So that's what the seventh trumpet is all about. And so it seems like this would be the end of the book. You know, we've got God's reign. It seems that this would just be the end of it, but it's not. We still have a ways to go. So when we move to this next chapter, we have a sudden shift. It's described here as a great sign appeared. So let's go ahead and read through this now. And there's a lot of questions that it raises, and it's a really interesting passage. I think there's some things that will be more clear in what they mean. There'll be symbols that are a little less ambiguous. And so let's just read through. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and her head a crown of 12 stars. This imagery here is already sounding, we've got this 12 stars, and this sun and moon under her feet, reminiscent of Joseph. But we've got this idea here of, Israel is coming to mind right away. And she was pregnant, and she cried out, being in labor and pain, and to give birth. Anybody who's read the New Testament, when we hear about this imagery, it may be getting us wondering about Jesus Christ. But there's also something odd about this, is if we're thinking about Jesus and what we'll keep reading. What is the timeline in this? When is this happening? Then another sign appeared. So it's the same language. It's using sign for the first time in Revelation. We haven't seen that. Then another sign appeared in heaven, and behold, a great red dragon, having 7 heads and 10 horns on his heads, were 7 crowns. So the image here is pretty clear of a red dragon. Remember with the horses that red represented war. And so red here may be doing a similar thing. We've got a dragon. It's like a very powerful animal. And these 7 heads, the 7, as we've been seeing it throughout Revelation, has been about this idea of completeness, fullness. Reading commentaries on this, that's what I saw as well. And it makes a lot of sense. Most of the times we've seen the number 7, it's been this idea of the fullness of it. So having 7 heads is like, it's like fully representative of this. 10 horns, probably representative of power and authority. Then we've got these 7 crowns, again, complete authority, this picture. And his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and hurled them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour the child. So there's some slightly confusing elements of this story with the stars being hurled down. But let's just look at the big picture. We've got a pretty clear story of a woman about to give birth, who early signs point to might have something to do with Israel. And then we've got the dragon ready to pounce. Having read ahead, I'm not going to make too many guesses about the dragon right now, even though my Bible's trying to give me some clues. But I will know that it's going to tell us the answer in a minute. So this is going to be a symbol that's clearly explained. And she gave birth to a son, a male who's going to rule over all of the nations with an iron rod. And her child was caught up to God and to his throne. Now, this is really interesting right here. So we have a description of the birth of Jesus. This language here, who is going to rule over all the nations with a rod of iron, is a description that's used in the Bible about Jesus, about the Messiah. And then this, caught up to God and to his throne, seems like a reference to the ascension of Jesus. So we're kind of jumping really quick in this from Christmas, the birth of Christ, to the ascension, where after having died and been resurrected, Christ ascended to heaven. And so this is automatically making a really interesting timeline question. If this is referencing the birth of Christ, it's definitely coming before all of this stuff we see in 11. In fact, all of the stuff we see in Revelation up to this point. This is a flashback. And so that's telling us a lot about what we're reading, and it came kind of surprising, so it may have been hard to notice. Secondly, it is also jumping forward a bit too, because it's jumping to after the ascension, so jumping all through the life of Christ very quickly. This is a big picture kind of telling. The symbols and the language being used in this vision right here are a big picture view of what Christ has done, and it happens very quickly. Then the woman fled into the wilderness, where she had a place prepared for her, so that she would be nourished for 1,260 days. Now, this 1,260 days is the same amount of time that the witnesses would prophesy. So it's the same length of time. And this is where I think we need to answer a question. So the question here was, who is this woman? The most obvious literal reading would be the woman is Mary. She is the mother of Christ who gave birth to him. However, even at the beginning, this is a little odd because this kind of cosmic battle between Satan and the woman doesn't seem to match with what actually happened with Mary, the mother of Christ, and Satan. There wasn't this cosmic battle between the two of them that we're seeing here. But where it becomes clear that it's not about Mary is in the birth of Christ, what happens next. See, the woman flees into the wilderness and is nourished for 1,260 days. We're going to see later on that this battle, since the dragon cannot get the woman, is going to involve the woman's children. And so, when we consider, is the woman Israel, the introduction part here makes a lot of sense. It covers a lot of ground. If the woman is a symbol for Israel, that explains the imagery with the 12 stars, with the sun and moon under her feet. And it makes sense that Christ, the Messiah, was born from Israel. That's an image that makes sense. However, it doesn't make sense, just as it didn't with Mary, for how the woman is fleeing and being persecuted after the birth. This seems to be describing something else. And so a lot of commentaries that I've read have indicated that this is probably representing Israel and the church. In other words, the community of believers in God. And I think this makes a lot of sense with how John has been talking up to this point. If you remember in his letters, he talked about the synagogue of Satan. He talked about the false Jews. And my sense here is that the woman is representing the true Jews as John sees them. Judaism that's connected to covenant relationship with God. And that the New Testament church, including the Gentiles who are part of it, are the true Israel, the true church, and are the offspring of this woman. And they are this woman. It's kind of a mixed symbol. So the woman here is definitely a reference to the Old Testament Israel, but also continues past the birth of Christ to be the true church, the true Israel. After this, we're going to shift from this kind of earthly perspective into heaven for war. And there was a war in heaven, Michael and his angels waging war with the dragon. The dragon and his angels waged war, and they did not prevail. There's not a lot of details here, just the outcome. And there was no longer a place found for them in heaven. This is really important. No longer a place found for them in heaven. So up until this point, Satan has had access to heaven. He's actually been working as an accuser there, right? And that's kind of what the word Satan means, accuser. And the role here, the idea here, is that Satan is speaking accusations in heaven. But right now, this is ended and Satan is no longer has a place. This is imagery in apocalyptic language. I think if we try to over-literalize this and we're thinking of angels fighting battles with swords, we may be taking this further than it wants. It's really talking about the outcome of Satan's rebellion and then his expulsion, and we're going to see how and why that happens. And the great dragon was cast down, the serpent of old, who is called the devil, and Satan, who deceives the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels thrown down with him. Satan was fighting Michael, but Satan and his angels were overcome and thrown down. But here we're going to have a hymn describing this event kind of from a different perspective that tells us how this happened. Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers, see the language here, and sisters has been thrown down, and the one who accuses them before our God day and night. This is describing what Satan's role was, accusing, but he's been thrown down. He can't do that anymore. And they overcame him because of the blood of the Lamb, because of the word of their testimony, and they did not love their life even when faced with death. Right? So there are three elements here, and the most important one is the blood of the Lamb. It's the sacrificial death of Jesus, but also the word of the testimony and not loving their life. We've seen here throughout about the role of martyrs and about the role of staying faithful to God. For this reason, rejoice, you heavens, and you who dwell in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you with great wrath, knowing that he has only a short time. And so now this is a picture of the devil who has been accusing in heaven and active in earth, but no longer has a place in heaven. So now he is going to be even more active on the earth. And the big picture of this is what the devil is up to now and kind of explaining the events that are about to happen after it and in the next portions of Revelation. This actually tells us what has been going on before. We've seen the devil active in Revelation so far, and we're going to see him continuing to be active. And this flashback actually reveals how the birth and then the death and resurrection and the ascension of Christ has left the devil no more room in heaven, that he now is going to be more active on earth, explaining what's going on. And when the dragon saw that he was thrown down to earth, he persecuted the woman who gave birth to the male child. This seems to be the reason that she fled into the desert here, right? So this whole section was kind of another little flashback explaining why the woman needs to be protected and why she needs to flee. But the two wings of the great eagle were given to the woman so that she could fly into the wilderness. So we had seen briefly that she was in the wilderness, and this is telling us about how she went there. Into the wilderness to her place where she was nourished for a time, times, and a half a time away from the presence of the serpent. This is a very weird way of saying it. A time, times, and a half a time away from the presence of the serpent. And the serpent hurled water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, so that he might cause her to be swept away with the flood. But the earth helped the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and drank up the river which the dragon had hurled out of his mouth. The imagery here is very rich and symbolic of the serpent trying to wash away and destroy the woman. And it just didn't work, right? It was thwarted. The earth itself is protecting her, right? Like God's creation, who God is even at work in the work to protect the woman, the true Israel, the community of God, from the destruction of being totally washed away from the face of the earth. So the dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her children who keep the commandments of God and to hold to the testimony of Jesus. Just reading this, it seems like that the woman being the kind of the true Israel, this is looking at the church or the people of God symbolically as one entity. And then the children I think, would represent the individual people living out life here on earth. As an individual or as an individual community of believers, they would be the children of the community of God. And so what we have here is that the devil cannot destroy all of the church. So instead, he's trying to wreak havoc on as many people in the church as possible. He can't destroy the church as a thing, so then he goes to focus on individual churches, individual believers, rather than the body of community of believers as a whole. And so there you go. That's the chapter. It appears that this is a flashback that's setting the scene for what's about to come next. And we're going to then see the beast rising up, and we're going to see what happens when the devil brings his persecution towards the children of the woman. And so we're going to be explaining this section. So there you go. That was the reading for the study with me this week. And we're going to be continuing this study on Friday with a more in-depth look at the meaning of this passage as a whole, looking at 4 different views and ways to interpret it. So we'll see you Friday, and God bless as we continue to study Revelation together.